All right. Normally I follow all of John's advice diligently, but today I'm going to stand because that's just easier for me to talk. But I trust that my voice will carry. And Wendy will give me a signal if someone on the WebEx will scream that that's not the case. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. And I'm aware that this is probably the nerdy subset of the nerdy crowd in DC, and so it is, entirely possible that the very intro remarks that I make here are, well known among you here. But I do assume that there are a few that have to direct this kind of work and aren't deep into the trenches, and so we figured it's good to have some sort of basic intro to this. The reason I do this is not because I am actually the world's expert in metadata, by far not, and initially I was surprised I was asked to do these intro remarks, but I've been involved in a couple of different things that are related, and click this away. The report in the middle is the one that John just mentioned, and there are some recommendations related to metadata that I will point to, but some of you might know me better from the work on Paradata I did, and in that context I got a lot of questions on what's the difference between Paradata and metadata and how does this all hang together. So head on to that. And then Julia Lane will later talk a little bit more about sort of modern vision of metadata, and some of that is reflected in our textbook here. So let me start with the metadata. What is that? In the Paradata book, I have in the introduction a little analogy that may or may not work here, but if you think of taking a picture in photography, and all the information that can come with such picture, right? We would think of Paradata as data that describes that process, right? What a photographer decided, which lens to take, whether the different angles they took in order to take a particular picture, and I was inspired to use the Eiffel Tower because I know Junior was just in Paris last week. But then also the different things you might say to a person we take the picture of, depending on which language you are doing that in. And so all of that, if we were to capture all of this, that would be Paradata. That's the process of getting there. The metadata is what happens at the end. You have your picture, and then there are a couple of, I'm going to sit while you keep talking. We have a little technical thing. Okay. I have to share something different. I'm sorry. Oh,
that's so cute.
All right. I have to share. Let's see. So when you have a finished picture, you usually have just one piece of information left, not that entire process. You don't know which lenses were tried. You don't know, whether we tried that to get the dog to smile. And you don't know, which angles we all tried out and why this one was chosen as the particularly best, or maybe it wasn't the best. This is not my finest moment of photography, but what we have at the very end is the date. We might have a geolocation. We might have an information about file storage, where the picture is, and the like. So it's a summary information of that final product at the end, right? Not the process. That's the difference between Paradata and metadata, and we'll come back to that later because one of the points I tried to make here is that process information is just as important. And so thinking of that entire data generation is something I want to get into your head. Okay, so that's on that. If we transfer this back to the survey world, as John asked us to do, in the survey world, the Paradata would be each contact attempt by an interviewer to a household. Every time you write down what the outcome code was, whether they were successful or not. And as a summary statistic of that, we have a response rate for a survey. And typically the response rate for the survey, right, aggregating up the final status of each outcome code with the survey, that's what goes into the metadata bucket. But what for the longest time we haven't captured was all the steps in between, which, increasingly a lot of agencies do. We call that Paradata, but the labels in effect aren't really that important. But we know we can also learn something from looking at what happened at each step. Okay, so keep that sort of in mind as we talk and you hear more about frameworks and things like that. So jumping ahead to the recommendation, and then I'll come back to sort of what has happened in the metadata world in between. So this report that spurred the series of workshops that John mentioned had a couple of observations and recommendations that I'm not going to read out here. I just want to alert you to that. The reason metadata was mentioned in there is that it's pretty clear that it's already a good idea to have a documentation of a certain data set, right? Just so in the way it is useful to know the response rate and, what variables are in a certain data set and who did the data collection and things like that. But in the same way, of course, if you want to combine them, it becomes even more important, right? All that additional context information, and you combine the data and you want to, at some point, make a decision on whether these two variables measure the same thing and whether you can, therefore, use them as linkage variable or you can use them jointly in a data set, you better know what the context is, right? So that is important, but we should be clear that all the errors we know can creep into a survey when we record these kind of things also creep into the other data sources. So don't think that, anything there is, much cleaner and needs less attention. There, too, we need to have some way of effectively communicating, and I'm on purpose not talking about standards, effectively communicating what data mean and what information is in the data aside from the actual values, right? So that's the goal, or the observation, right? There is sort of a messiness that we need to be aware of, so the pledge for being transparent. I guess the conclusion that followed out of this was that when we create statistics and use these multiple data sources, we, the whole thing is rather complex, and it is instrumental that we do know enough about the process to provide clarity. And the recommendation related to clarity and accessibility is listed here, and the sentence in the middle is the one that's sort of most relevant for this workshop. It's recommended that metadata are preserved and properly archived. Okay. The report is entirely silent on what metadata is. It's entirely silent on how the data should be archived and reported. And, I guess if the book would be twice as long, one could have gone into detail, but it's also, I'm not sure if it was the right crowd necessarily to give the best recommendations there. So it's just as well that we have this workshop here and hear from some other people as well. So let me talk about some of the implementations that are in place and that probably inspired folks on the committee to write these pieces into the recommendations. There are several initiatives, and the next talk will go into more detail on what those standards are and the intricacy of them. I put those up here only to show you that this effort here has been going on for a long time in other places. There's most famously, at least, no, I shouldn't say that, most known to me, the Data Documentation Initiative has been going on for a long time. There are a couple of other initiatives, more recent DARA, metadata schema, and I'll show that in a moment. But there's also the Statistical Data and Metadata Exchange. These are standards. These have been attempts for a long time to sort of unify what do we report. So think of APOR response rate standards. There is, a document that you can look up how you compute the response rates and what you should document and what have you, right? For a single survey, these kind of standards work well, right? You have all kinds of predefined fields, I'll come back to that in a moment. You have predefined fields who created the data, what happened to it, what was the methodology that went into creating the data, like, the sampling at the time dimensions and those kind of things. So that's set for a given data set. Works beautifully, right? And once that given data set is finished, there has been attempts to put a stamp on it, one place to find it. That's called a digital object identifier. And these are all great things, So that's important, and we do need that, just like we need an ISBN number to find a book when we search for it. So this is sort of the data equivalent of this kind of cataloging as we know it, libraries have done for a long time, and think of this as a catalog system for data libraries, right? That's made it the closest analogy that I could give you. So in practice, and I'm going fast because I'm trying to make up for some time loss, but I realize I talk very fast. So you can ask me questions afterwards if I'm anyway, so in practice, this whole thing has turned out to be much harder than one thing, right? So standards fine, but in practice there are a whole bunch of problems that I encountered, and I'm sure you did too with your colleagues. So here I'm switching heads. For the last almost 10 years, I've worked in the Institute for Employment Statistics in Nuremberg, in Germany, partially at least. And there is a fantastic research data center, and they really try hard to ingest data that are created at the IAB survey, and try hard to make the administrative data accessible to everybody. And they have been wrestling with what kind of data documentation system to put in there for a long time. In part because no system really had all the categories they needed, in part because the data they would get never had all the information they needed to then fill the systems, so they're empty fields and whatnot, and in part also because there was absolutely no incentive for anyone who created the data to really go through the process of documenting this out. This takes forever, right? And so, the DOI is a nice thing. Slowly, the Institute for Employment Research has come around to acknowledge those that work on data products, to, in the annual evaluations at least, acknowledge it. But it's not quite the same as having a published article and a record that way, right? And so there is really no incentive to do that well. Hence, it's not done well. I mean, with all best intentions, but it's just a conflicting interests and pressures on folks creating these data sets. And then those that are in charge of documenting, they can only document what they know, right? If they weren't in part of the data generating process, if they haven't seen all the paradata, well, yeah, they can capture some summary statistic, but does that tell us enough about the process that we're going? So that's an important piece to keep in mind. And that's only for survey data for the old world. Now, if we think of the new world, where we have data that comes in constantly and is not designed up front, right? Not custom-made to a research problem where ahead of time we can define, oh, here's a questionnaire. It has, like a scale answer category, so we know how to code that. It has a binary answer category, so we can put that information, it's the binary variable, into our data documentation. No, in practice, increasingly we move to data sets that are of a completely different nature. Think about Twitter, but you could use any of the constantly flowing data generating processes, whether it's within program agencies or on social media or through traffic sensors or what have you. They all produce metadata, right? It's as the Wire in July wrote, everything we tweet, every picture we take, every status update we do on Facebook, it has metadata associated with it. And folks over in London have looked at this a little bit more closely, and they said, okay, it's not longer 140 characters, but then when it was, that each tweet had an additional 144 fields of metadata. I haven't checked that and counted myself, and I found other sources telling me a different number of metadata. But that already shows you a problem with that here. These platforms, and that same is true for program agencies when they administer programs or what have you over a long period of time, it's changing all the time, right? Eventually, it was possible to retweet. Eventually, it was possible to add your geolocation. Eventually, it was possible to record who liked the tweet, and now you can download an entire tweet statistic if you go into Twitter. I mean, any tweet that you do your own, but you also also when you download the field. And so this is a living product. So what is that piece of metadata that I would store for Twitter, right? And how do I interpret that? If I look at Twitter data from 5 years ago, where certain fields weren't existent, or the whole context has changed on how that was reported, right? Completely new challenge, and I mean, without being an expert in these various initiatives that I mentioned before, my outside perception is they are not prepared to capture that dynamic, right? And so that's something to keep in mind. Probably not so visible given the screen here, but just briefly, all these data that I just mentioned, data types, they come in what's called JSON files. Already in those files, you can see that they are not structured in a way that you can clearly say, oh, here's the row and here's the column, and for every case I have these particular variables. No, a tweet has whatever information that tweet has, right? And over time that might change, and that's why this flexible file format JSON was created, so that we are not restricted to rows and columns in the fixed standard. Makes the documentation even harder. So when you look at the Twitter documentation site, or what Twitter puts out themselves, they talk about over 100 attributes. We learned before how much over that is. But this is captured in these JSON files. And what they put out here as a warning, as you can see, when you are collecting historical tweets, it's important to understand how some metadata is as it was when tweeted, not how it is now, right? And when you submit queries, you need to take that into account, right? So they themselves are aware that this is not an easy task, and the same would be true if we deal with data that come from long-ranging administrative processes. So the recommendations, I guess, or the further outlook is to think of an approach in organizing this that's somewhat more flexible, and takes advantage of the knowledge and process, I guess, in the same way as we decided to keep the process data for surveys. That happens when you analyze the data. And to not only pitch our own products, let me start with things happening over at Princeton. Matt Galganek was in town yesterday, or might still be hanging around here somewhere. He was at Mathematica talking a little bit about the social science, data science summer camp. And if you look at their website, there was a shout out to one of the students there who wrote a little piece of code that was meant for a particular data set to classify what kind of data format or variable type is in that data file, and provided a piece of code on GitHub that can then be used by others to create the same kind of classification or to augment and change and whatnot. And these kind of attempts, you will hear later on a little bit more when Julia Lane is introducing the Administrative Data Research Facility that, well, I guess it's that she created with the help of many others, but mostly Julia's vision here, where the idea really is that we need to find a way to capture the process of ingesting the data, working with the data, and all the knowledge that people working with the data and analyzing it sort of gather or already have about the data. I will leave it with this teaser and just summarize here that metadata are clearly absolutely key to the data documentation. That they arise in a context that we should not ignore. And it is important that we find a way to sort of understand what's recorded, especially when we combine multiple data sources. I'm fortunate right now to work over at Facebook until the end of the year, at least part of my time, and I've more than ever realized how important it is, because if you see that world of different tables and data people created in such a large organization, if they didn't have a system that would constantly point to this table or this data that was created using these sources and this documentation, and here is, a notebook or a clip that points to how that was created, and this was the author of that particular variable. If you hadn't had that information, there would be no way of ever understanding what's in these data sets. You look at them, and with the best documentation, you might not know, but at least you know whom to go to ask more, right? And so this network of information, I think, is something we should discuss here and how that could be implemented, and I hope that we will hear about some of those ideas later on. Why do we need to do that in a more flexible way, or at least I think we need, is that the documentation itself is hard. It's not fixed. The content does change. It's often boring for those that have to do it. Researchers are researchers for a reason and not accountants. And it's often not rewarded in the process. So possible solutions you should, well, we all hope we will think jointly about, is to automate as much as possible, but also to incentivize and maybe gamify, personalize the things that happen, and rely a little bit more on crowdsourcing than we normally are used to in the statistical offices. I think we have sort of a tendency to want to issue a lot of control that might not be possible for the data that are generated through processes that are out of our control in the first place. All right, and with that, thank you.